Since they're tools that better fit our hands if we're going to a fire, we should try them on here and see how they would have been used if the fire had been reached while it was at its present size of about 60 acres. At that size, it's doubtful that the crew would have tried to hit it on its nose. It's a dangerous business to attack a good-sized fire straight on. Instead, they would have started flanking it close to its front and tried to steer it into some open ground, some stretch of shale or light grass where the fire would burn itself out, or burn so feebly that it would be safe to take on directly. It's a ground fire of this size that, as suggested earlier, is brought under control by digging a fire line around it, a shallow trench 2 or 3 feet wide, scraped deep enough to expose mineral soil. All dead leaves, needles, even roots are removed so that nothing can burn across it. If any dead trees lie across it, they also must be removed, and likewise any standing trees with low branches that the fire might use to jump the line. To put a fire under control is to establish and then hold such a line around it, especially around the part of it that is most likely to advance. What follows is called mopping up work, working back and forth from the fire line into the interior of the fire, digging shallow graves and dropping still burning trees into them, and of course burying everything on the ground that smokes. The tools that perform these two operations are, with one exception, those that have done most of the hard work of the world: axes, saws, and shovels. Salih says he was single-tooled and was carrying a saw, and Navon started with the other saw, which he soon traded off to Rumsey, who was carrying the heavy water can. Power saws, of course, were already invented, but those early ones were mechanical monsters. It took a whole crew just to crank one, so that they were of no use to the Smokejumpers until well into the 1950s. The crew's two saws would have been two-man hand saws, and in making a fire line would have been used to cut trees lying across the line or standing too close to it. In mopping up, they would have been used to drop the burning snags. The not always clear reference to tools by the two surviving crew members indicate that besides these two hand saws, the crew had 2 or 3 shovels and 11 or 12 Pulaskis. Laird Robinson, who when I first met him was information officer at the Smokejumper base in Missoula, says that number sounds about right for a crew of 16 at the time. Even the numbers show that the Smokejumpers' tool of tools was the Pulaski. It was the forest firefighters' one invention, primitive but effective, invented strictly for firefighting. It was even named after the Forest Service's most famous firefighting ranger, Edward Pulaski, who in 1910, when many thought the world was ending in flames, put a gunny sack around his head and led 42 half-paralyzed men through smoke to a deserted mining tunnel that he remembered. The cold air rushed out of the tunnel and was replaced by heat so intense it set fire to the mining timbers. Pulaski kept the fire in the tunnel under control by dipping water with his hat from a little stream that went by the mouth of the shaft, and he had enough control over his men to make them lie flat with their mouths on the ground. He was badly burned and finally passed out, and from time to time they all fell unconscious. But all recovered except 5 men and 2 horses. The Pulaski is a kind of hybrid creation, half axe and half hoe. I remember the first one I ever used, an early handmade one, nothing more than a double-bitted axe with one bit left on, and a little hoe welded to where the other axe bit had been. Even after all these years, the Pulaski is still the tool for digging fire lines. A little hoe goes deep enough because its job is to scrape the stuff that would burn off the surface of the ground. So the hoe makes the line, the axe bit chops little trees or shrubs along the line that might let the fire jump across. And it has other uses, such as chopping roots. When the foreman ends his first lesson to his trainees on how to use a Pulaski, he says, "For the next couple of hours, all I want to see are your asses and your elbows." Behind the crew with the fast Pulaskis came a couple of men with shovels who clean out and widen the fire line. And of course, in the mopping up operation, shovels are all important in making shallow graves and burying whatever is still smoking. The crew strung out on the trail. Those with unsheathed saws were behind because the long teeth and rakers of the saws make them hard to carry and dangerous to follow too closely. Most of the double-tooled men were carrying Pulaskis, and for the second tool, either a shovel or a water canteen or a first aid kit or a rattlesnake kit. The flank of the fire was in plain view only half a mile across the gulch, although from the cargo area its most advanced front on top of the ridge was not visible. They had seen it from the sky and remembered that on top of the ridge it was burning slowly downhill into a saddle. They had no trouble guessing what they would be doing 10 or 15 minutes from now when they caught up to their foreman in the fire. He would line them out on both the Man Gulch and Meriwether flanks to make fire lines that would keep the fire from spreading farther down either canyon, so limit its advance to the top of the ridge where, forced into the saddle in light grass, it would be easy to handle. Dodge would space the men with Pulaskis about 10 to 15 feet apart, depending upon the ground cover, and they wouldn't raise their heads until they had caught up to the man in front of them. Then they would tap him on the leg with a Pulaski and say, "Bump." If the two men right behind had also finished their stretch, they would say, "Bump 3." To a smoke jumper, bump is a musical word if he is the one who sings it out. When smoke jumpers work next to a regular crew of Forest Service firefighters, they take pleasure in leaving them bruised with bumps. As the crew started for the south side of the gulch, they had it figured out before they even had an order. They would work all night establishing a line around the fire. From then on, it would depend. The smoke jumpers couldn't be touched when it came to getting a line around a fire, but they usually didn't win medals in mopping up. They were all in the business for money. Forestry school students, the fancy MA, MD, and PhD students, and especially the jump-happy boys who hoped to make enough money in the summer to shack up all winter in Honolulu. So there was no use putting a little fire out of its misery too soon when you could be paid overtime. The crew started up the side of the gulch toward the fire. It was about 5 o'clock. The next day, a wristwatch of one of the boys was found near his body. Its hands were permanently melted at about 4 minutes to 6. This must come close to marking the time when it was also over for most of the others. So there were about 56 minutes ahead of them. Time to do only a little thinking, and undoubtedly only a little is all they did. It is not hard to imagine what was in their heads. They knew they were the best, and they were probably thinking at least indirectly about being the best, sizing up the firehead as a kind of pushover. They thought of what they were in as a game, and they were the champs, and the fire didn't look like much competition. They already had developed one of the best ways of facing danger in the woods, the habit of imagining you are being watched. You picture the mountainsides as sides of an amphitheater crowded with admirers, among whom always is your father, who fought fires in his time, and your girl. But even more clearly, you can see yourself as champion, crawling through the ropes. You would give this small-time amateur fire the 1-2 and go home and drink beer. It was more than 100 degrees on that open hillside, and all of them were certainly thinking of beer. If anything troubled them, it was the thought of some guy they had tangled with in a Missoula bar, who they were hoping to show up again tomorrow night, and each boy from a small town such as Darby, Montana, or Sandpoint, Idaho, was undoubtedly thinking of his small-town girl, who was just finishing high school a year behind him. She had big legs and rather small breasts, but that did not get in the way. She was strong like him and a great walker like him, and she could pack 40 pounds all day. He thought of her as walking with him now and shyly showing her love by offering to pack one of his double tools. He was thinking he was returning her love by shyly refusing to let her. The answer, then, to what was in their heads when they started for the fire has to be, not much. Like the frontier cavalry, the smoke jumpers didn't kill themselves off at the start of a march. They loosened up for about a quarter of a mile down gulch, then began to climb toward the fire, but they hadn't climbed more than 100 yards before they heard Dodge call to them from above to stay where they were. Shortly, he showed up with Jim Harrison, the Recreation and Fire Prevention Guard stationed at the campground at the mouth of Meriwether Canyon. Harrison had spotted the fire late in the morning while on patrol duty, returned to Meriwether Station, and tried unsuccessfully to radio both Missoula and Canyon Ferry Ranger Station outside Helena at 12:15. 10 minutes before the fire was first officially reported by the lookout on Colorado Mountain, 30 miles away. After he tacked a sign on the station door, "Gone to the fire, Jim," he again had climbed the 1,500-foot precipice between Meriwether Canyon and Man Gulch, and had been on the front of the fire alone until Dodge found him around 5 o'clock. He had tried to do what he was supposed to do, stop the fire from burning down into scenic Meriwether Canyon. Meriwether Canyon is a chimney of 1,500-foot precipices and pinnacles. In minutes, it could draw flames through the length of its funnel and be heat-cracked rocks forever after. It is one of America's tourist treasures, and Harrison had fought to save it. Later, 2 sections of fire line that he had scraped with his Pulaski were found burned over at the top of the ridge between Meriwether and Man. His tracks were there too, burned over. Harrison was known to many of his crew because he had been a smoke jumper himself the summer before in Missoula, and ironically had switched to patrol duty and cleaning up picnic grounds to please his mother, who was afraid smoke jumping was dangerous. Now here he was with Dodge and this crew of smoke jumpers on its mission of August 5th, 1949, and he might as well have run into General Custer and the 7th Cavalry on June 25th, 1876, on their way to the Little Bighorn. In addition, as recreation and patrol guard, he could not have been in a good physical shape as the jumpers. The forest supervisor's description of his job makes clear that primarily he was a recreation guard, keeping the public grounds and facilities at Meriwether Landing tidy for the tourists, and only upon special assignment was he to get into patrol and fire prevention work. As the supervisor told the Board of Review, Harrison had made only one patrol before August 5th. Realizing he was in need of exercise, Harrison would hike up to his patrol point on his days off, but he couldn't have been in shape to keep up with the jumpers if the going got tough, and yet, that day he had twice climbed the perpendicular trail to the top of the ridge between Meriwether and Man and fought fire alone for 4 hours while the smoke jumpers had done nothing but jump and walk a quarter of a mile plus 100 yards. Both Sully and Rumsey record briefly the crew's meeting with Dodge and Harrison after those two left the front of the fire. Sully reports Dodge as saying that all of them had better get out of that thick reproduction because it was a death trap, and then instructing Hellman to return the crew to the north side of the gulch and head them down the canyon to the river. Rumsey said Sully agreed, and Sully agreed. Dodge didn't look particularly worried. Dodge has a characteristic in him, Rumsey told the board. It's hard to tell what he's thinking, and Dodge probably wasn't yet alarmed since he told Hellman that, while the crew was proceeding toward the river, he and Harrison would return to the cargo area at the head of the gulch and, as others had already done, eat something before starting on the trail. Still, it is clear Dodge hadn't cared for what he saw when he took a look at the front of the fire. He said it was not possible to get closer to the flames than 100 feet, and the thick reproduction he was worried about was a thicket of second-growth ponderosa pine and Douglas fir that had sprung up after an earlier fire and was tightly interlaced and highly explosive, especially with the wind blowing up gulch. Primarily, the retreat to the river was for the safety of the crew, but if the wind continued to blow up gulch, the crew could attack the lower end of the fire from its rear or flanks to keep it from spreading, especially into Meriwether Canyon, which, like a good chimney, drew a strong updraft. If worst came to worst and the wind changed and blew down gulch, the crew could always escape into the river. Dodge gave Hellman still another order, not to take the crew down to the bottom of the gulch, but to follow contour on the other slope, by which he meant that the crew should stay on the side hill and keep on an elevation from which they could always see how the main fire on the opposite side was developing. Hellman led the crew across the gulch and started angling for the river, and sure enough, it happened as nearly always does when the second in command takes charge. The crew got separated and confused. Considering the short time Dodge was gone, highly confused and separated by quite a distance. Sully says they ended up in 2 groups, 500 feet apart, far enough apart that they couldn't see each other, and so confused that Sully's group thought they were in the rear only to have to stop and wait for the rear group to catch up. Rumsey says that part of the time Navone, the former paratrooper from Bastogne, was in the lead. He was the one really professional jumper and professional adventurer among them, and evidently was always something of his own boss and boss of the whole outfit if it looked to him as if it needed one. This is all that happened in 20 minutes Dodge was gone. But instead of being just a lunch break for the boss, it also was something of a prelude to the end. At least it can make us ask ahead of time what the structure of a small outfit should be when its business is to meet sudden danger and prevent disaster. In the smoke jumpers, the foreman is nearly always in the lead, and the second in command is in the rear. On the march, the foreman sizes up the situation, makes the decision, yells back the orders, picks the trail, and sets the pace. The second in command repeats the orders, sees that they're understood, and sees that the crew is always acting as a crew, which means seeing that the crew is carrying out the boss's orders. When they hit a fire, the foreman again is out in front deciding where the fire line should go, and the second in command is again in the rear. He repeats the foreman's orders, he pats his men on the back or yells at them, and only if he can't himself get them to do what they should, does he yell to the foreman, "They're making lousy line." Although the foreman has little direct contact with his men, even on a friendly basis, his first job is to see that his men are safe. He is always asking himself, where is a good escape route? It is easy to forget about the second in command, who has a real tough job. He is the one who has to get the yardage out of the men, so he has to know how to pat them or yell at them and when. He has to know his men and up to a point be one of them. But he has to know where that point is. Being second in command, he will have a hard time, especially when he first takes command. A little friendship goes a long way when it comes to command, and they say Hillman was a wonderful fellow, but that may be part of the reason why when he first took command, the outfit became separated and confused. It could also have been partly the crew's fault. Now that they weren't going to hit the fire head on, some of the excitement was gone. Fighting a fire from its rear is not unusual, but it doesn't show how much horsepower you have. The crew, though, was still happy. They were not in that high state of bliss they had been in when they expected to have the fire out by tomorrow morning and possibly be home that same night to observe tall dames top-heavy with beer topple off bar stools. On the other hand, attacking the fire from the rear would make the job last longer and mean more money, and in a Smokejumpers' descending states of happiness, after women comes overtime. Actually, the priority could be the other way around. To the crew, the fire was nothing to worry about. Dodge felt otherwise as he and Harrison sat eating at the cargo area near the head of the canyon. From where he could see almost to the river, he told the Board of Review, "The fire had started to boil up and I figured it was necessary to rejoin my crew and try to get out of the canyon as soon as possible." He picked up a can of Irish white potatoes and caught up to his crew roughly 20 minutes after he had left them. It was about 5:40, according to his testimony. Dodge had Hillman collect the crew, then station himself at the end of the line to keep it together this time while he himself took the lead and headed for the river. Things went fast from then on, but never fast enough for the crew to catch up and keep ahead of disaster. Ron Norum, who is one of the leading specialists on fire behavior in the Forest Service and still a fine athlete, as an experiment started out where Dodge rejoined his crew, and moving as fast as possible all the way, did not get to the grave markers as fast as the bodies did. Of course, there was nothing roaring behind him. When the crew crossed back from the south to the north side of Man Gulch where they had landed, they crossed from one geography into another and from one fire hazard into one they had never dealt with before. Man Gulch is a composition in miniature of the spectacular change in topography that is pressed together by the gates of the mountains. Suddenly the great plains disappear. Suddenly the vast Rocky Mountains begin. Between them there is only a gulch or two like Man Gulch for a transition from one world to another. Before the fire, the two sides of Man Gulch almost evenly divided the two topographical and fuel worlds between them, a side of the gulch for each world. The south side, where the fire had started, was heavily timbered, and the formal description of the report of Board of Review, at the point of origin of the fire, the fuel type consisted of a dense stand of 6 to 8 inch diameter Douglas fir and some ponderosa pine on the lateral ridges. But it was a different type of fuel on the north side, where the crew was now on its way to the river. At the point of disaster, the tree cover consisted of stringers of scattered young ponderosa pine trees with occasional over-mature ponderosa pine trees. The ground cover or understory was a bunch grass with some cheatgrass. Essentially, the north side of Man Gulch was rocky and steep with a lot of grass and brush and only a scattering of trees. The south side was densely timbered. The difference between the two sides of the gulch is, after all these years, still clearly visible. On the south side, the charred trees stood until their roots rotted. Then winds blowing up gulch from the Missouri left them on the ground, unburied but paralleling each other, as if they belonged to some nature cult, ultimately joined together by the belief that death lay in the same direction. At times they look as if they had been placed together, black draped coffins from some vast battle awaiting burial in a national cemetery on a hillside near a great river, if not the Potomac, then the Missouri. On the north side, where the crew is angling toward the river, there are white crosses with bronze plates and a few black odds and ends, not much else. The men died in dead grass on the north slope. Several generalizations will help with what lies ahead if we remember that they are only generalizations. A fire in dense timber builds up terrific heat, but not great speed. As Harry Gisborne has said, a big run for a ground fire is from a half mile to a mile an hour. A grass fire, by comparison, is usually a thin fire. It builds up no great wall of heat. It comes and is gone, sometimes so fast that the top of the grass is scarcely burned, sometimes so fast it doesn't even stop to burn a homesteader's log cabin, just burns over and around it, and doesn't take time to wait for the roof to catch on fire. Even so, since the great fire catastrophe of 1910, far more men had been killed by 1949 on fast, thin-fueled grass fires east of the Continental Divide in Montana than on the slow, powerful fires in the dense forests of western Montana. Arthur D. Moore, Jr., supervisor of the Helena National Forest, generalizing in his 1949 testimony about the Man Gulch fire, said fires east of the Continental Divide in Montana are smaller, and because of less fuel are more quickly controlled, but he went on to add that to his knowledge only 2 men had been burned in forest fires in Idaho and western Montana since 1910, whereas he counted 35 who had burned to death east of the divide in fast grass. The grass and brush in Man Gulch could not be faster than it was now. The year before the fire, the gates of the mountains had been designated a wilderness area, so no livestock grazed in Man Gulch, with the result that the grass in places was waist high. Since it was early August with blistering heat, the worst of both fire worlds could occur. If a fire started in the deep timber of the southern side, where most fires start, then jumped to the explosive grass and shrubs on the northern side, as this one might and did, it could burn with the speed of one of those catastrophic fires in the dry gulches of suburban Los Angeles, but carry with it the heat of the 1910 timber fires of Montana and Idaho. It could run so fast you couldn't escape it, and it could be so hot it could burn out your lungs before it caught you. Things got faster and shorter. Dodge says they continued down gulch about 5 minutes, so he says between an eighth and a quarter of a mile, which is saying about the same thing. Dodge was worried, evidently no one else was. The fire was just across the gulch to be looked at, and that's evidently what they were doing. They were high enough up the slope now that they could almost peer into its insides. When the smoke would lift, they could see flames flapping fiercely back and forth. A damn bad sign, but they found it interesting. Navone was in his element as a freewheeler, alternating between being benevolent and being boss. He had lightened Rumsey's load by trading him his saw for Rumsey's heavier water can, so Rumsey especially was watching the scenery as it went by. He observed that the fire was burning more fiercely than before. A very interesting spectacle, he told the Board of Review. That was about all we thought about it. Of the stations of the cross they were about to pass, this was the aesthetic one. On forest fires, there are moments almost solely for beauty. Such moments are of short duration. Then Dodge saw it. Rumsey and Sully didn't, and probably none of the rest of the crew did either. Dodge was 33 and foreman and was supposed to see. He was in front where he could see. Besides, he hadn't liked what he had seen when he looked down the canyon after he and Harrison had returned to the landing area to get something to eat. So his seeing powers were doubly on the alert. Rumsey and Sully were young, and they were crewed and were carrying tools and rubbernecking at the fire across the gulch. Dodge takes only a few words to say that it was what he saw. We continued down the canyon for approximately 5 minutes before I could see that the fire had crossed Man Gulch and was coming up the ridge toward us. Neither Rumsey nor Sully could see the fire that was now on their side of the gulch, but both could see smoke coming toward them over a hogback directly in front. As for the main fire across the gulch, it still looked about the same to them, confined to the upper third of the slope. At the review, Dodge estimated they had a 150 to 200-yard head start on the fire coming at them on the north side of the gulch. He immediately reversed direction and started back up the canyon, angling toward the top of the ridge on a steep grade. When asked why he didn't go straight for the top there and then, he answered that the ground was too rocky and steep and the fire was coming too fast to dare to go at right angles to it. You may ask yourself how it was that of the crew only Rumsey and Salih survived. If you had known ahead of time that only two would survive, you probably never would have picked these two. They were first-year jumpers. This was the first fire they had ever jumped on. Salih was 1 year younger than the minimum age, and around the base they were known as roommates who had a pretty good time for themselves. They both became big operators in the world of the woods and prairies, and part of this story will be to find them and ask them why they think they alone survived. But even if ultimately your answer or theirs seems incomplete, this seems a good place to start asking the question. In their statements soon after the fire, both say that the moment Dodge reversed the route of the crew, they became alarmed. For even if they couldn't see the fire, Dodge's order was to run from one. They reacted in seconds or less. They had been traveling at the end of the line because they were carrying unsheathed saws. When the head of the line starts its switchback, Rumsey and Salih left their positions at the end of the line, put on extra speed, and headed straight uphill, connecting with the front of the line to drop into it right behind Dodge. They were all traveling at top speed, all except Navon. He was stopping to take snapshots. The world was getting faster, smaller, and louder, so much faster that for the first time there are random differences among the survivors about how far apart things were. Dodge says it wasn't until 1,000 to 1,500 feet after the crew had changed directions that he gave the order for the heavy tools to be dropped. Salih says it was only 200 yards, and Rumsey can't remember. Whether they had traveled 500 yards or 200 yards, the new fire coming up the gulch toward them was coming faster than they had been going. Salih says by the time we dropped our packs and tools, the fire was probably not much over 100 yards behind us, and it seemed to me that it was getting ahead of us both above and below. And if the fire was only 100 yards behind now, it had gained a lot of ground on them since they had reversed directions. And Rumsey says he could never remember going faster in his life than he had for the last 500 yards. Dodge testifies that this was the first time he had tried to communicate with his men since rejoining them at the head of the gulch, and he's reported as saying for the second time something about getting out of this death trap. When asked by the Board of Review if he had explained to the men all the danger they were in, he looked at the board in amazement, as if the board had never been outside the city limits and wouldn't know sawdust if they saw it in a pile. It was getting late for talk anyway. What could anybody hear? It roared from behind, below and across, and the crew inside it was shut out from all but a small piece of the outside world. They had come to the station of the cross where something you want to see and can't shuts out the sight of everything that otherwise could be seen. Rumsey says again and again that the something he couldn't see, the top of the ridge. I had noticed that a fire will wear out when it reaches the top of a ridge. I started putting on steam, thinking if I could get to the top of the ridge, I would be safe. I kept thinking the ridge, if I can make it. On the ridge, I'll be safe. I forgot to mention I could not definitely see the ridge from where we were. We kept running up since it had been there somewhere, maybe a mile and a half or 100 feet. I had no idea. The survivors say they weren't panicked, and something like that is probably true. Smokejumpers are selected for being tough, but Dodge's men were very young, and, as he testified, none of them had been on a blow-up before, and they were getting exhausted and confused. The world roared at them. There was no safe place inside, and there was almost no outside. By now they were short of breath from the exertion of their climbing, and their lungs were being seared by the heat. A world was coming where no organ of the body had consciousness but the lungs. Dodge's order was to throw away just their packs and heavy tools, but to his surprise, some of them had already thrown away all their equipment. On the other hand, some of them wouldn't abandon their heavy tools even after Dodge's order. Dietert, one of the most intelligent of the crew, continued carrying both his tools until Rumsey caught up with him, took his shovel, leaned it against a pine tree. Just a little farther on, Rumsey and Salih passed the recreation guard, Jim Harrison, who, having been on the fire all afternoon, was now exhausted. He was sitting with his heavy pack on and was making no effort to take it off. And Rumsey and Salih wondered numbly why he didn't, but no one stopped to suggest he get on his feet or give him a hand to help him up. It was even too late to pray for him. Afterwards, his ranger wrote his mother and, struggling for something to say that would comfort her, told her that her son always attended Mass when he could. It was way over 100 degrees. Except for some scattered timber, the slope was mostly hot rock slides and grass dried to hay. It was becoming a world where thought that could be described, such as was done largely by fixations. Thought consisted in repeating over and over something that had been said in a training course, or at least by somebody older than you. Critical distances shortened. It had been a quarter of a mile from where Dodge had rejoined his crew to where he had the crew reverse direction. From there, they had gone only 500 yards at the most before he realized the fire was gaining on them so rapidly that the men should discard whatever was heavy. The next station of the cross was only 75 yards ahead. There they came to the edge of a scattered timber with grassy slope ahead. There they could see what is really not possible to see, the center of a blow-up. It is really not possible to see the center of a blow-up because the smoke only occasionally lifts, and when it does, all that can be seen are pieces of death flying around looking for you. Burning cones, branches circling on wings, a log in flight, without a propeller. Below in the bottom of the gulch was a great roar without visible flames, but blown with winds on fire. Now for the first time they could have seen to the head of the gulch, if they had been looking that way, and now for the first time, to their left the top of the ridge was visible, looking when the smoke parted to be not more than 200 yards away. Navone had already left the line, and on his own was angling for the top. Having been at Bastogne, he thought he had come to know the deepest of secrets, how death can be avoided, and, as if he did, he had put away his camera. But he really knew at that moment how death could be avoided. He would have had to know the answers to two questions. How could fires be burning in all directions and be burning right at you, and how could those invisible and present only by a roar all be roaring at you? On the slope ahead of the timber, Dodge was lighting a fire in a bunch grass with a gopher match. He was to say later at the review that he did not think he or his crew could make the 200 yards to the top of the ridge. He was also to estimate that the men had about 30 seconds before the fire would roar over them. Dodge's fire did not disturb Rumsey's fixation. Speaking of Dodge lighting his own fire, Rumsey said, "I remember thinking that was a very good idea, but I don't remember what I thought it was good for. I kept thinking the ridge, if I can make it on the ridge, I will be safe." Sally was with Rumsey. Dietert, who before being called to the fire had been working on a project with Rumsey, was the third in the bunch that reached Dodge. And on a summer day in 1978, 29 years later, Sally and I stood on what we thought was the same spot. Sally said, "I saw him bend over and light a fire with the match. I thought, with the fire almost on our back, what the hell is the boss doing lighting a fire in front of us? Another fire in front of us?" It shouldn't be hard to imagine just what most of the crew must have thought when they first looked across the open hillside and saw their boss seemingly playing with a matchbook in dry grass. Although the Man Gulch fire occurred early in the history of the Smokejumpers, it is still their special tragedy, the one in which their crew suffered almost a total loss, and the only one in which their loss came from the fire itself. It is also the only fire any member of the Forest Service had ever seen or heard of, in which the foreman got out ahead of his crew only to light a fire in advance of the fire he and his crew were trying to escape. In case I hadn't understood him at first, Salih repeated, "We thought he must have gone nuts." A few minutes later, his fire became more spectacular still when Salih, having reached the top of the ridge, looked back and saw the foreman enter his own fire and lie down in its hot ashes to let the main fire pass over him.